Soviet Union in the 1980s had gone through a series or a few decades of pretty much stagnant economic growth, and had also gone through a series of pretty ineffectual, reactionary, pretty much like elderly leadership, yeah. And yeah, so people were kind of beginning to lose faith in the system, yeah. Corruption was rife, as we've discussed in our previous video on what if Russia had become Muslim, so definitely check that out. There had been a high level of alcoholism, which was plaguing the nation, and people were just in general starting to lose faith in the system. And this is, domestically, like, so, there were food shortages, there were, like the command economy was basically beginning to disintegrate, and people were starting to feel really down. And during this time as well, you'd had billions and billions and billions of dollars being wasted on fighting the Americans, like in the Cold War, with the arms race and fighting all the different proxy wars around the place. And it didn't help that the Soviet Union didn't really have like allies as such. It more had like satellite states which it had to kind of keep in check, like against the will of its own people, which meant that they then had to send in lots and lots of troops in order to kind of keep these people like under control. And obviously we saw examples of this in Hungary in 56, and we saw it in Czechoslovakia in 68, and in many other cases like this. And nearly every single one of these satellite states had to be propped up with Soviet money as well. And most notably of all was the case of Afghanistan, in which Soviet funds, Soviet material and Soviet blood was being spent in order to keep the hills of Afghanistan communist. There had been a revolution in Afghanistan, but this was mainly centered in like the major cities like Kabul. But as is the case today, the vast majority of Afghanistan is very tribal, it's very rural, and the people there don't like foreign ideas kind of being imposed on them. And so the Mujahideen, the soldiers of Allah, they rose up against the communist regime there. And the Soviet troops, were sent in to try and prop up this regime, but they were unable to keep control over much of the territory outside of the major cities and the major highways. And it didn't help also that the Americans, who were trying to get revenge on the Soviets for arming the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War, they also decided to start arming the Mujahideen, and training them as well. So arming a bunch of Islamic extremists, that's never gonna come back at all. Oh wait, that's awkward. But anyway, like, this is the 1980s, and they didn't know any of those things were gonna happen yet. So to put it lightly, the Soviet Union was in a bad shape. And so it was almost a godsend, to this atheist country, when Mikhail Gorbachev, who's relatively young, and he's a great reformer and a modernizer, and he wanted to make like the Soviet Union great again as such. He ended up becoming the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. So what he wanted to do was to completely change things up. And he summarized this with two general policies. One was perestroika, which was restructuring of the economy, so that it was less centralized, like less top down. So he wanted it to be more along co-ops and basically more localized kind of organizations. And then on top of that, he also wanted to have glasnost, which basically means openness. So he wanted people to have the ability to criticize the system with the hope that through this criticism they could make some reforms and tweak the system in a way that would keep it going and that people would have faith in it still. However, the problem with all this is that glasnost at the time before perestroika had really kicked in was pretty much, that's what I think was like the death knell of the Soviet Union, because you can't have people suppressed for like almost 70 years and then open the door to criticism. We kind of saw this with the de-Stalinization in the 1950s. You allow people to criticize elements of the system, and all of a sudden you end up having riots and revolutions and stuff, because people are going, no, we don't like the entire system, and that's the problem, right? However, it's important to note that even today, in 2021, there are still some countries which are still communist, but don't really look communist anymore. And most notably of all was China. So at the same time, China, Vietnam, and quite a lot of other communist countries, what they basically did was the equivalent of perestroika without having any glasnost. And the case of Tiananmen Square is a perfect testament to this. So people in the People's Republic of China, they wanted to, actually have a bit of like people power. And in response to that, the communist government there sent in the tanks and massacred the people. When this happened in the Soviet bloc, nothing happened. He didn't send in any tanks. He didn't, like Gorbachev just kind of let the whole thing collapse. And this is probably wise in many ways because it now allowed the Soviet Union to kind of focus in on itself rather than trying to maintain this kind of massive empire and stuff. And yeah, so in a way, it's almost, I don't want to say America first, but it's kind of Soviet Union first. It's interesting enough what Stalin kind of proposed at the beginning of his premiership, which was the idea of socialism in one country. So, you try and focus in on yourself, try and improve things in your own country, and then hopefully other countries follow, rather than this kind of world revolution where you're trying to spread communism all around the world. So in many ways, it would have kind of been a revert back to that. So this is perhaps some of the things that could have been done in order to avoid it. So we're going to kind of dive into a bit more of the alternative history, but before we do that, we're also going to have to give a bit more of the context. So people within the elite classes of the Soviet Union, they benefited a great deal from the corruption that was there. And the last thing that they wanted was for anyone to come in and to try and reform the system, because obviously if you benefit from the system, why do you want it reformed? And as a result, many of these people kind of conspired with each other, and they came together, and they were behind the August coup. So the August coup, that was when Soviet tanks rolled through the streets of Moscow. They captured Gorbachev. They captured all the different things within Moscow and tried to basically take over the entire country again. Much in the same way, actually, that the Bolsheviks first came to power in 1917. That was essentially a coup as well. And they tried to basically do a repeat of that. The problem with all this is that out of the conspirators, there was none who had the same kind of razzle-dazzle and leadership skills of a Lenin or Trotsky, etc. These people were just grey blurs. They were no ones, right? And people were like, who are these people? And so as a result, the whole coup kind of lacked credibility and it kind of quickly collapsed in itself. The problem with all this, though, from the Soviet Union's perspective, and from Gorbachev's perspective in particular, was that Boris Yeltsin, who was the leader of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, he basically took advantage of the situation. So Russia, obviously being the dominant nation within the Soviet Union, he basically stoked up Russian nationalism and used it as an opportunity to dissolve the Soviet Union. So as a result, when it came to Boxing Day of 1991, for the last time, the flag was lowered on the Kremlin, and the Soviet Union ceased to be. But this didn't need to necessarily happen, and this is what we're going to go into now. We're going to go through a list of different things which I think if they had done differently, the Soviet Union in some form would still exist today. Maybe not in the same way that it had, of course, but I think it still would exist. And so that's what we'll get into now.